When we think about the 1984 presidential election, we usually think about the electoral landslide of Ronald Reagan over Walter Mondale, and that's about it. Yes, Reagan won 97.6% of electoral votes and won nearly 59% of the popular vote. And for Walter Mondale, he will go down as one of the biggest losers in presidential election history. But when Mondale entered the presidential election in 1983, this wasn't the case, as Reagan looked to have a battle on his hands. But Mondale wasn't the only Democrat seeking to unseat the Republican president. In this video, we are going to talk about the 1984 Democratic primary, which saw the introduction of two people who would have an impact on Democratic Party politics in the 1980s: Colorado Senator Gary Hart and civil rights leader Jesse Jackson. But before we get into the video, make sure you subscribe to the channel and like the video. I want to thank everyone who has subscribed, liked, and commented in the videos so far. If you have any ideas for future videos, please let me know down in the comments below. If you would like to support the channel even more, then you can join my Patreon with the link down below. I would like to thank all my Patreon members, as your help allows me to spend more time on developing these videos. And with that, let's jump into the 1984 Democratic presidential primary. The 1982 midterm elections were brutal for Republicans. In the House of Representatives, the Democrats picked up 26 seats. While many of these pickups were a result of redistricting, particularly in southern states, the Republicans lost throughout the nation, from the South to the Northeast to Ronald Reagan's own home state of California. On top of that, Reagan's popularity was plummeting. After the assassination attempt on Reagan in March of 1981, when his approval rating was at its highest at 68%, at the time of the midterm elections, it had sunk to 43%. By January 1st of 1983, that rating would drop to 35%, the lowest in his presidency. And why did Reagan's popularity drop? In July of 1982, according to Gallup, 51% of Americans said that Reagan's economic policies had made them worse off, with only 29% saying that it had made them better off. Unemployment was also high at the time, with the unemployment rate at 10% on Election Day in 1982. In addition, many saw Reagan's policies as helping wealthier Americans instead of helping working class Americans. Put all of this together, and you end up with a Democratic midterm victory. And while the Democrats did do well in the House, they didn't perform as strongly in Senate elections, with the Republicans still controlling that chamber. 1 month later, the first Democratic candidate to enter the race for the presidency was California Senator Alan Cranston, who I talk about more in my video about the politics of California, which is one of my best videos, so check it out after this video. At the time he announced, Reagan's approval rating had increased to 40%, but still low enough to make him vulnerable for re-election. Cranston was one of the most well-known senators at the time of his announcement, serving as the assistant minority leader in the U.S. Senate. Of course, he came from Reagan's home state and had sparred with Reagan when Reagan was the governor of California. And at this time, California hadn't become the deep Democratic state that we know it today, but was considered the biggest swing state prize in the Electoral College. Cranston made his announcement in the Senate caucus room. But it was the Senate caucus room in Concord, New Hampshire, not the one in Washington, D.C., where so many others had made their announcements. In his announcement, Cranston admitted that he didn't have the same name recognition as other potential candidates, saying, quote, "I don't have Walter Mondale's name recognition. I did not serve as vice president to Jimmy Carter. I do not have John Glenn's name recognition. I am not an astronaut. Name recognition has absolutely nothing to do with the qualities or lack of qualities that we seek in a president." End quote. And by making this announcement in New Hampshire, he knew that his way to the presidency would be to perform well in early primary and caucus states, with the UPI saying, quote, "He may have been taking note of the victory rung up by Jimmy Carter, who came out of nowhere to capture the state's 1976 Democratic presidential primary." End quote. Again, more about that in this video. But February was a busy month for announcements. 2 weeks after Cranston made his announcement, Colorado Senator Gary Hart threw his name into the Democratic presidential contest. Hart made his announcement on the steps of Colorado State Capitol on February 17th in front of a crowd of 800 people. At his announcement, Hart, who was George McGovern's campaign manager in 1972, said, quote, "We now face a stark choice between national renewal or national decline. Our problems worsen while some retreat to an unfair past and others debate old remedies and contend over shop-worn policies." End quote. And that last part of that last sentence is what differentiated Gary Hart from someone like Alan Cranston. Hart could be considered one of those fiscally responsible Democrats, and yes, I'm using air quotes, by saying that the way to economic prosperity was to cut spending as well as cut taxes. Hart would argue that Reagan cut taxes for the wealthy, but needed to be cut for the middle class as well. Hart's campaign really wasn't different from Al Gore's campaign in 1988 and Bill Clinton's campaign in 1992. In fact, Al Frum, who would eventually found the Democratic Leadership Council, the organization that gave us Al Gore and Bill Clinton, supported Gary Hart in the Democratic primaries. Hart was also one of the Atari Democrats, which were Democrats who supported increasing investment in technology, which would also require looser trade policies, especially with Asia. Their overall view was that investing in technology would eventually help both society and the economy. This is the genesis of the Democrats' love fest with Silicon Valley and the tech bros. So, yes, Hart could be considered the first third way or new way Democrat for the presidency. But instead of flat out saying that he opposed previous Democratic policies, he said there needed to be another way to look at governance, hence the name Third Way. 4 days after Hart made his announcement, former Vice President Walter Mondale made his announcement at the Minnesota State Capitol. Of course, any former vice president would be a contender for the nomination of their party for president. Remember, this time in the Democratic Party was a time of transition. The old time Democrats like Hubert Humphrey had either passed away or were out of politics, and the new face of the Democratic Party, like Al Gore and Bill Clinton, were just getting their feet wet. This allowed for a vacuum for people like Mondale, who was probably one of two of the most well known Democrats running. We'll get to the other one shortly. Mondale's approach was a mixture of the liberal policies of Cranston and the third way policies of Hart. During his time in the U.S. Senate, Mondale was considered much more moderate on economic policies than many of his Democratic Senate colleagues. And when he became vice president, Jimmy Carter's policies were not considered liberal or progressive either. Still, the economic problems that faced the Carter administration naturally followed Mondale into his 1984 presidential campaign. Instead of talking about the economy, he focused more on the role of government. In Ronald Reagan's 1981 inaugural address, he stated that government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem. In Mondale's announcement speech, Mondale said while government can be the problem, it is not the problem. Human suffering, a faltering economy, a dangerous arms race, a divided America, these are the problems. Mondale could be considered the Big Tent candidate for the Democrats. He appealed to the traditional liberals in the party who were economic liberals, supporters of civil rights, and those who were more dovish on foreign policy. But because of his moderate positions on the economy in the past in the Senate, he was able to compete with Gary Hart in this newly emerging wing of the Democratic Party. This put Mondale in the safe, well known moderate lane and essentially made him the immediate frontrunner in the campaign. 2 days after Walter Mondale made his announcement, former Florida Governor and U.S. Trade Representative Reuben Askew made his announcement for president. Askew, who was a popular two-term governor of Florida, was very similar to Gary Hart, a moderate on trade and an Atari Democrat. In his announcement from Tallahassee, Askew talked about breaking down trade barriers and competing in the technology sector, with the Orlando Sentinel reporting, quote, he told reporters in Washington that computers, robots, and high technology are forcing changes in the world as basic and profound as any since the Industrial Revolution. Askew said that America's future may well depend on our willingness and our ability to accept and adjust to the changed nature of the world. End quote. Like Cranston, Askew was not well known outside of Florida, though he was one of the Southern governors that redefined Democratic politics in the South in 1970, which I talk about in more detail in part one of my series on the Southern Party Switch, which is probably the most researched video I have on this channel. But for many in the media, Askew, who had not held public office during the time of his announcement, thought that he was running for the vice presidency. In fact, because he was one of the only Southern candidates at the time, he was considered to be the most conservative candidate in the race. In response, Askew said, quote, "It's an interesting thing because when I was in Florida, you kept calling me a liberal," end quote. But Askew wasn't the most conservative candidate in the race. That would be Ernest Fritz Hollings, a U.S. Senator from South Carolina, who I featured in my video about the most qualified candidates to ever run for president. Hollings made his announcement on April 18th, but had already visited 36 states before his announcement to test the waters to see if he was a viable candidate. When it came to his campaign, he was more to the right of both Hart and Askew when it came to spending policy, calling for freezing entitlements, federal pay, and other spending initiatives. He even called for a freeze in defense spending, though he did say that having a strong defense was a cornerstone of his campaign. But his approach was different from Reagan's. Instead of spending a lot of money on military hardware, Hollings wanted to focus on improving the readiness of conventional troops, increasing rapid deployment forces, wanting to make the military more efficient, while at the same time limiting resources. And while he might not necessarily be considered an Atari Democrat, he did recognize the challenges that the United States faced when it came to the technology battle between the United States and Japan. However, instead of breaking down trade barriers, he wanted to make them tougher, making it harder for Japanese products to be sold in the United States. He also wanted to increase spending on education, something that he championed when he was governor of South Carolina, in order to give the United States an edge in the technological war. However, one of the problems for Hollings was his views on race. While governor of South Carolina, Hollings was a soft supporter of segregation. But once the federal government made a number of rulings in the 1960s regarding civil and voting rights, Hollings said that the issue was settled and worked to break down the segregation barriers. Basically, he was the opposite of George Wallace when it came to battling the federal government on civil rights issues. Still, because of his pre-1960s views on civil rights, it would be hard for him to build any kind of support outside of the South. Now we've come to the other candidate that I said was probably just as well known as Walter Mondale, and in reality, probably more well known, and that was Senator John Glenn from Ohio, the first American to orbit the Earth and considered by many to be a national hero. Now, just for a minute, I'm going to break the timeline and interject my own opinion. I have said, and I always will say, that John Glenn was the best candidate for the Democrats in 1984. Not only was the eventual nominee Walter Mondale connected to the economic problems of the Carter administration, which would lead to Reagan using his famous "Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago" line, but the Reagan campaign did the whole patriotic red, white, and blue campaign. Nobody screams patriot more than John Glenn. Again, the first American to orbit the Earth and could have died on re-entry because of the problems with his heat shield. On top of that, the movie The Right Stuff was released in October of 1983, giving Glenn even more of a reputation of being not just an American hero, but a natural leader, and the movie portrayed him as the leader of the Mercury 7 astronauts. Now, I don't know if Glenn would have won, as that is purely hypothetical, but I personally think that he was easily the best candidate for the Democrats in 1984 and would have at least given Reagan a run for his money. Okay, with that being said, who was John Glenn? Well, he wasn't too far off from Gary Hart, saying that the Democrats needed to be fiscally responsible, strong on national security, and needed to accommodate both liberals and conservatives. Honestly, his campaign lacked any specifics when it came to the issues. The main part of his campaign that he was a moderate Democrat who could win the general election using his popularity. He was also a military man who had served in the Marines, possibly giving him a stronger standing with the military against Reagan, someone who only acted for the military. But there was one problem that Glenn's Senate administrative assistant, William R. White, noticed. With Glenn running on his popularity and his lacking on policy specifics, he wondered if Glenn could fall into the Ted Kennedy, Roger Mudd, why do you want to be president trap. Basically, Ted Kennedy was asked why he wanted to be president when running for the Democratic primary against Jimmy Carter and basically gave the worst answer possible. I talk about that more in this video here. For Glenn, White was worried about the same problem. Another thing that hurt Glenn's campaign, and something else that White noticed, was that Glenn wasn't the best political speech giver and could come across as dull. And this is where I will say in the movie The Right Stuff, Glenn's character, played by Ed Harris, makes Glenn look much more charismatic than he actually was. In a general election, could the movie version of John Glenn clash with the real John Glenn personality on the campaign trail, especially against a real actor like Ronald Reagan? Again, we'll never know, but one could assume that that could have been an issue. From this point on, there would be a break in those announcing that they were running for president, with the field now being Mondale, Hart, Hollings, Askew, Scranton, and Glenn. And with the stage set, for now, and Glenn's entry into the Democratic primaries, both Mondale and Glenn were the perceived frontrunners for the Democratic nomination. 1 month after Glenn had announced that he was entering the race, a Gallup poll showed that Glenn would not only beat Reagan in the general election matchup, but would absolutely dominate. In that poll, which was conducted in the beginning of May, Glenn would defeat Ronald Reagan by 17%, with Glenn at 54% to Reagan's 37%. But when Mondale was matched against Reagan, the gap shrunk, with Mondale leading, but only by 6%, with 49% for Mondale and 43% for Reagan. The main reason for this difference was independent voters. Independents preferred Glenn over Reagan by 7%, while they preferred Reagan over Mondale by 14%. Still, in the Democratic primary matchup, Mondale was leading Glenn in the nationwide primary poll by 6%. However, another poll conducted by the New York Times and CBS News, a once respected institution, had Glenn up by 2% over Mondale in the Democratic primary. Previously, in both of these polls, Mondale had a double digit lead against Glenn, but now all of that had evaporated with Glenn's announcement. While the Democratic Party was starting to see a centrist shift and the candidacies of Glenn, Hart, Hollings, Askew, and even Mondale reflected this, there were still liberals, especially anti war liberals, who were still holdovers from the Vietnam War era. One candidate that tried to reach out to these voters was Alan Cranston. While the Vietnam War had been over for 8 years, the issue of nuclear proliferation was becoming more salient amongst anti war voters. On May 23rd, Cranston started focusing on the issue of a freeze on nuclear weapons, making it the cornerstone of his campaign. And while he wasn't competing with Glenn or Mondale for the top spot in the polls, he consistently polled third. But in a straw poll at the Wisconsin Democratic Party State Convention, Cranston pulled off an amazing upset, winning the straw poll with 789 delegates, with neighboring candidate Walter Mondale receiving 727 delegates. Gary Hart, who is still considered a relative unknown at the time, finished a strong third with 443 delegates. While Glenn was fourth place, he only received 39 delegates, being closer to fifth place Reuben Askew than to third place Gary Hart. However, even though these straw poll results were impressive, they didn't really mean anything in the grand scheme of things. Ask anyone with the last name Paul. For both Hart and Cranston, the straw poll didn't result in improving in the polls, with Mondale and Glenn still being considered the frontrunners. However, noticing that the nuclear freeze issue was something that could pull some weight amongst rank and file Democrats, 3 days after the straw poll, Mondale started to make the nuclear issue a visible part of his campaign, with the Mondale campaign worrying about the possible surge in support for Cranston. And that worry wasn't helped with Alan Cranston winning yet another straw poll, but this time held by the Young Democrats of Alabama. Cranston received 65 votes out of the possible 124 votes available. Again, while these results were impressive for Cranston, the polls going into July didn't change, with Mondale now the frontrunner and John Glenn running a close second, far ahead of all the other candidates. July continued to be a decent month for Mondale, who now had a firm lead in the national polls and was up by 15% in the most recent Iowa poll, with 45% support to John Glenn's 30%. Cranston, with all of his straw poll victories, was a distant third at 4% and Hart at 3%. While Glenn did creep up in the Iowa poll, Mondale still had the edge. When it came to fundraising, Mondale also had the advantage. In the first 6 months of 1983, Mondale had raised $5.1 million to Glenn's $2.6 million. As for Alan Cranston, who was receiving a lot of press for his straw poll victories and nuclear-centric campaign, his campaign was $355,000 in debt. Going into August, there was one major question, and that was whether civil rights leader Jesse Jackson was going to enter the race. All indications were that he was going to enter, but nobody knew when that decision would be made. The main question for Jackson, as well as black voters, was if a black candidate could win the presidency. Black voters were hesitant to support Jackson because they didn't know if Jackson could win over white voters, which would be needed to win the general election. Remember, up to this time, Shirley Chisholm was the only black candidate to have any impact on the Democratic nomination process, and it was minimal at that. So this was very much an unknown, which made it harder for Jackson to get black Democratic leaders behind his campaign. 24 years later, Illinois Senator Barack Obama was faced with the same challenge. But after his victory in Iowa, which showed that he could win white voters, black leaders quickly abandoned Hillary Clinton and went over to Obama. One candidate that did enter the race on September 13th was 1972 Democratic nominee George McGovern. As with Mondale, McGovern saw that the anti-war and anti-nuclear weapon vote within the Democratic Party establishment was still strong. The problem was that the standard bearer for that cause, Alan Cranston, was still relatively unknown and had a campaign that was in debt. McGovern also campaigned on many of the issues that defined his 1972 campaign, such as ending poverty, reducing military spending, and revitalizing the New Deal and Great Society policies of the Democratic Party, feeling that the current Democratic field was trying to move away from those policies. Once McGovern entered the race, he polled around 8%, jumping into third place and cutting Scranton's support in half. One campaign that thought that McGovern's entry into the race could help them was John Glenn. Remember, Mondale had also made the nuclear weapon issue an important part of his campaign, which gave him enough of a cushion to be the frontrunner in the latest polls. Glenn's campaign hoped that McGovern would take away enough votes from Mondale to put Glenn back into the lead. And just like in February, Glenn's campaign strategy was about electability, and he had some good data to back that up. In a late September Washington Post ABC News poll, Mondale had a 2% lead over Ronald Reagan in a general election matchup. As for Glenn, he was leading the president by 10%, at 52% compared to Reagan's 42%. Time after time, when head-to-head polls between Reagan and the Democratic field were conducted, Glenn continued to have the greatest chance against Reagan. Still, Mondale continued to lead in the Democratic primary polls. One person that we haven't talked about in a while is Gary Hart. Up to this point, his campaign was going nowhere. Yes, he had that impressive showing in the Wisconsin straw poll, but nothing more than that. With that, in late September, Hart changed up his campaign. First, he brought in Congresswoman Patricia Schroeder as his national campaign co chair. Something that none of the candidates had done to this point was to try to court female voters. With Schroeder on the team, who was a pretty significant name in Democratic Party political circles at the time, this helped Hart gain credibility with female voters. And yes, I absolutely know what you're thinking about. The second thing that he did was to put all of his efforts into the primaries and caucuses in New Hampshire, Maine, and Vermont. Early in the election season, the DNC had all three of these primaries being held on the same day, but now they were within the space of a week, but still concurrent. The contest after that would be Wyoming, which Hart assumed that he could win since he was the neighboring Western senator. And while it seemed like a smart electoral strategy, the strategy was purely based on money and the lack of name recognition. Therefore, Hart had to concentrate on those states because it was the only states that he could afford to compete in, as he couldn't run a national campaign. This wasn't helped by the fact that a straw poll was conducted in Maine on October 1st, with Mondale winning with 51% of delegates to the Maine Democratic Convention, with Alan Cranston second place. According to the Kennebec Journal, both spent about $100,000 to try to win the straw poll. Holland spent $30,000 at the convention, with Glenn only spending $7,000. Gary Hart and Reuben Askew didn't spend anything and didn't show up for the convention. While there were a few Democrats in the field, the political party establishment was lining up behind Walter Mondale. On September 30th, the National Education Association, the largest education union in the nation, endorsed Mondale for president. The next day, the AFL-CIO endorsed Mondale, winning 93% of member support. This gave Mondale both an advantage in organizing, which was vital in the early states, especially the caucus state of Iowa, but also a vote advantage, as union members were a significant chunk of the Democratic electorate. A week later, Mondale would get more good news, this time out of Iowa. First, Mondale won a straw poll at the Iowa Democrats' Jefferson Jackson dinner, with Alan Cranston almost predictably by now finishing second. On top of that, Mondale was leading Glenn in the most recent Iowa poll by 19%, putting him in a strong position to win the state's caucuses. When it came to the general election, Mondale now had a 10% lead over Ronald Reagan in Iowa, after being behind Reagan in previous polls. But at that same Jefferson Jackson dinner, Mondale won on the attack against Glenn. Each of the candidates were allowed to speak at the dinner, with Mondale being the last of the speakers. In his speech, he criticized Glenn for voting for Ronald Reagan's 25% tax cut in 1981. Mondale said Glenn's vote, quote, would have been a good time for a Democrat who is against special interests to stand up and decide to vote no, end quote. The next day, while campaigning in Melbourne, Florida, Glenn went on the attack against Mondale, saying that the alternative to Reagan's 1981 tax cut was a return to the failed policies of the Carter administration, which devastated the economy, attacking inflation and interest rates at the time. In response, Mondale tagged Glenn as being a supporter of Reaganomics, saying, quote, Reaganomics was the worst massive deliberate economic mistake in our history. It drove us into our deepest recession, cost millions of jobs, resulted in thousands of bankruptcies, saddled the next generation with $1 trillion in debt, plummeted the American farmer, devastated international trade, and ushered in the cruelest assault on social justice in American history. Mondale continued, if there ever was a clear test of who stood for special interest and who stood for public interest, this was it. And also added, wealthy Americans and major corporations got massive tax cuts, while Americans of average income received no relief at all. State and local governments were forced to raise taxes and cut services. At the time, Glenn voted for Reaganomics and for massive military spending increases and cruel cuts in human services, end quote. While most of the Democrats in the U.S. Senate voted for the Reagan tax cut, two senators that didn't were Fritz Hollings and Gary Hart, being two of the only 10 Democrats who voted against it. But a few days later, the focus of the campaign would shift to foreign policy. On October 23rd, two suicide bombers in trucks packed with explosives bombed the multinational forces in Lebanon barracks, killing 307 people, 241 of them being Americans, mostly Marines. This was followed by the invasion of the island of Grenada by the US military. As far as the frontrunners, Mondale criticized Reagan for not seeking authorization from Congress before attacking Grenada, while Glenn talked about his military background and questioned why Reagan had placed American troops in Beirut in the first place. But when it came to the general election polls, Reagan had now moved ahead of both Mondale and Glenn, but Glenn was still the strongest candidate against Reagan. In a late October Washington Post ABC News poll, Glenn was behind Reagan by 3%, while Mondale was down by 6%. On November 3rd, the last of our presidential candidates enters the race, Jesse Jackson. While Jackson's chances of winning enough delegates to win the Democratic nomination was unlikely, he could win enough delegates to prevent Walter Mondale from getting enough delegates to reach a majority. This possibility could lead to Jackson and his supporters being kingmakers in a brokered Democratic convention. Still, early on in his campaign, it was hard to get black Democrats, especially those established in the Democratic Party, over to his side. While they sympathized with Jackson, they still saw Mondale as their best chance of winning, as well as being part of the Democratic establishment. This actually caused friction amongst black elites and black voters, with black voters being excited about Jackson's candidacy, but people like Atlanta Mayor Andrew Young still supporting Mondale. On December 10th, Mondale would win the endorsement of the National Organization of Women, a group that Gary Hart had tried to win. Hart criticized the endorsement process, saying that the governing board who made the decision were more concerned about politics rather than substantive issues. On the same day, the Alabama Democratic Conference, the Alabama Democratic Party's political caucus, endorsed Walter Mondale. This set the tone early for Jackson's campaign. This endorsement made it clear that black Democratic elites were not going to side with Jackson, and that the only way to move forward was by winning without these elites. Going into 1984, Walter Mondale had the momentum. Another Washington Post ABC News national poll showed Mondale with 49% of national Democratic support, with Glenn further behind at 23%. Jesse Jackson was at 5%, with Alan Cranston also at 5%. By this time, the Cranston campaign was lowering their expectations, with campaign manager Sergio Bendixson saying that finishing a respectable third place in Iowa and New Hampshire would be enough for the campaign to continue beyond those states. Gary Hart was at 2%, still focusing in the Northeast, and Ruben Askew was at 1%. Between October and December, a few debates happened between the candidates, but since this is 1984 and not everyone had access to cable television, with C-SPAN being essentially the only station showing the debates, they really didn't matter much. The first major debate between the candidates was on January 15th at Dartmouth College, hosted by Phil Donahue and Ted Koppel. John Margolis and Lee Danowski of the Chicago Tribune said of the debate, quote, Walter Mondale and John Glenn engaged in a short but spirited shouting match on Sunday, perhaps to the benefit of one of the other Democratic presidential candidates sharing the stage with them, end quote. Glenn called Mondale's policy gobbledygook, with Mondale saying that Glenn's attack was baloney. But Mondale went a bit further, saying that Glenn was using voodoo numbers regarding his economic policy, which goes back to George Bush calling Reagan's economic policy voodoo economics. Glenn then said that Mondale was using third grade arithmetic. As for Gary Hart, he said that the arguing between the two showed why the Democrats needed to look for new leadership. With the debate being all over the place, nobody was really considered the consensus winner. However, the criticism against Glenn started to mount. As someone who had been behind Mondale for months, he came across as looking like an eventual bitter loser, and the polling showed this as well. After the debate, Glenn's polling numbers started to drop, being from the mid-20s to being in the teens, now tied with Jesse Jackson in second place, with Mondale dominating, hovering around 50%. With that debate out of the way and Mondale basically on cruise control, the other campaigns refocused their efforts. The Jackson campaign doubled down on winning black voters, connecting the messaging of his campaign to the movement of Martin Luther King Jr. Remember, Jackson was standing next to King when he was assassinated in Memphis in 1968. As for Glenn, he started focusing on what the Washington Post called basic American values. The goal was to try to differentiate himself from both Ronald Reagan and Walter Mondale. The problem was that the Mondale campaign had done a really good job at making Glenn look like Reagan with a D next to his name. And while this strategy might have helped Glenn in the general election, remember he was still performing better than Mondale in the head to head matchups against Reagan, it seemed to be the wrong message to win a Democratic primary. On January 25th, the first superdelegates pledged to their preferred candidate. The first superdelegates to pledge were from the House Democratic Caucus, with Mondale winning 46 delegates, Glenn winning 14 delegates, Cranston with 6, Askew with 4, Hart with 3, and Hollings with 2. 2 days later, Glenn fired his campaign manager, William White, and replaced him with Gerald Vinto, a Boston political consultant who had been running Glenn's Iowa operations. Of course, Glenn was dropping into polls, but it was reported that the campaign had spending problems, didn't focus on early primary states, and failed to get any major endorsements. But with the early states approaching fast, this change was a little bit too last minute to have any real impact. Still, the Glenn campaign set the focus yet again on placing Glenn between Reagan and Mondale. Another campaign that was in flux was the Jackson campaign. On the positive side, Jackson was able to negotiate the release of Navy Lieutenant Bobby Goodman, who was being held by the Syrian government after he had been shot down over Syrian controlled territory in Lebanon. While the White House didn't endorse this move by Jackson, he was praised by Ronald Reagan for his efforts. This gave Jackson credibility when it came to foreign policy, a perceived weakness before. But in mid February, Jackson made a comment to Milton Coleman of the Washington Post, in which he said that New York was Jaime Town and referred to Jews as Jaimes, considered to be a derogatory term against those who are Jewish. This, along with Jackson meeting with PLO leader Yasser Arafat, didn't bode well, and Jackson was attacked for his comments. Jackson would later admit that he made those remarks and apologized for the comments. The Democrats held another debate on February 11th in Des Moines, Iowa, just 3 days before the Iowa caucus. Unlike the last debate, this debate was calmer, with all the candidates laying out their positions and vision for the country. Post-debate polling suggested that Mondale and McGovern were considered to have the strongest performances. Still, it didn't change much. The Iowa caucuses, held on February 20th, saw Mondale win with 48.9% of state delegates, with Gary Hart in a surprising second place, but far back at 16.5%. Third place was another surprise, George McGovern winning 10.3% of state delegates. The biggest loser of the night was John Glenn, only winning 3.5% of state delegates, finishing behind both Alan Cranston and Uncommitted. This was not just a huge blow to Glenn's campaign, but a boost for Gary Hart, who was someone that was competing in the same ideological lane as Glenn. This also blew a big hole into Glenn's electability argument, with the media now focusing on Hart as the new challenger to Mondale. The next 3 contests were to be held in New Hampshire, Maine, and Vermont. And if you remember from earlier in the video, I mentioned that Hart had been organizing in these states for months, significantly more than other candidates. With that, Mondale's attention moved away from Glenn and towards Hart. As with Glenn, Mondale would charge that Hart didn't have any strong plan and that he was just trying to win votes based on age instead of policy. And Mondale had reasons to worry. On February 28th, Hart won the New Hampshire primary with 37.3% of the vote, nearly 10% more than second place Walter Mondale. New Hampshire completely shifted the campaign. Mondale was no longer the clear frontrunner, with Gary Hart now within the margin of error in the national polls. Alan Cranston had dropped out of the race the day after the New Hampshire primary after accumulating nearly $1 million in campaign debt, Ernest Hollings also dropped out that same day, not having any real traction. The same held true for Reuben Askew, who said he was suspending his campaign but never came back to the campaign trail. The momentum for Hart would continue in the other New England states. On March 4th, Hart won the Democratic caucuses in Maine with 50.7% of delegates compared to 43.7% for Mondale. Glenn didn't even crack 1%. 2 days later, Hart won a massive 70.1% in the Vermont primary, with Mondale at 20%. Jesse Jackson, who was endorsed by Burlington Mayor Bernie Sanders, finished third at 7.8% of the vote. John Glenn wasn't even on the ballot in that state. Still, after the New England wins, Hart was now the leader in the national polls, with Mondale still within the margin of error. John Glenn had dropped into the single digits, no longer even being a factor in the primaries. On March 9th, Fritz Hollings endorsed Hart, forming an anybody but Mondale movement. Hart would also win the Wyoming caucuses, giving him 4 victories in a row. The next set of primaries was the Super Tuesday primaries, held on March 13th, with primaries being held in Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island, and caucuses being held in Hawaii, Nevada, Oklahoma, Washington State, America, Samoa, and Democrats abroad. 2 days before Super Tuesday, another debate was held in Atlanta, Georgia, with Mondale, Hart, Glenn, Jackson, and McGovern in attendance. This was a nationally televised debate hosted by NBC and moderated by John Chancellor. During the debate, Hart continued talking about having a new generation take over the Democratic Party. But for Mondale, he continued to attack Hart's lack of policy, coming up with this line.
Glenn, can I respond to that?
Well, we'll come back to you. Let some of the others.
What's new about coming out from entrepreneurs? You know, when I hear your new ideas, I'm reminded of that ad. Where's the beef?
Yeah.
Now, let me put this into context. In 1984, Wendy's ran a commercial.
It certainly is a big bun.
It's a very big bun.
Big fluffy bun.
It's a very big fluffy bun.
Where's the beef?
Some hamburger places give you a lot less beef on a lot of bun.
Where's the beef?
At Wendy's, we serve a hamburger we modestly call a single. And Wendy's single has more beef than the Whopper or Big Mac. At Wendy's, you get more beef and less bun.
Hey, where's the beef? I don't think there's anybody back there.
You want something better. You're Wendy's kind of people.
For those of you who are younger and don't know about this commercial, this was a very popular commercial. I mean, extremely popular. Therefore, when Mondale made this debate zinger against Hart, it had an American cultural connection that most people could relate to. But even with Mondale's attacks on Hart during the debates, Hart would dominate Super Tuesday, winning all of the contests except Hawaii because he wasn't on the ballot, Alabama, running 7% behind Walter Mondale, and somewhat Florida. In Florida, Hart won the popular vote with 42% to Mondale's 35.7%, but Mondale had the most delegates coming out of Florida. While Hart was the biggest victor, Mondale had enough superdelegates coming out of these states to make the defeat more palatable. The big loser of the night was John Glenn. If Glenn's message of having a centrist Democrat run against Reagan was to win over moderate to conservative Democratic voters in the South, it didn't work. Glenn was a distant third or worse in every single primary. 3 days later, Glenn dropped out of the race. The day before Glenn's withdrawal from the race, George McGovern dropped out of the race. McGovern had hoped to perform well in Massachusetts, the only state that he won against Richard Nixon in 1972. However, he finished third, nearly 20% behind the winner, Gary Hart. The next few primaries and caucuses were important to each of the remaining candidates for a number of reasons. First, Walter Mondale had failed to show that he had any reach outside of party elites, doing particularly poorly in primary states. As for Jesse Jackson, one major primary, his home state of Illinois, and one caucus, the Michigan caucus, had high African American populations and would show if Jackson actually had electoral support, since the black elites had basically abandoned him for Mondale. Now, I know people are going to say that Jackson's home state was South Carolina, and while it technically was, he was from Chicago. As for Gary Hart, he needed to do the opposite of Jackson, showing that his base was broader than moderate white Democrats. The next significant date was March 17th, in which Arkansas, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Michigan held their contests. These were all important for Jackson because of the large black population, but they were also caucus states, which were more likely to be controlled by party elites. As for Hart, he also wanted to show that he could perform well in the South, as he had been seen as simply doing well in the Northeast up to this point. On the 17th, Mondale won Arkansas, Mississippi, and most importantly, the Michigan caucuses. Mondale won 49% in Michigan, with Hart finishing second at 31% and Jackson a distant third at 16%. Of course, having the backing of the AFL-CIO helped in this highly unionized state. But on top of that, Hart had called the AFL-CIO a special interest group, which many of its members didn't take too kindly to. As for Jesse Jackson, he won the South Carolina caucuses, winning 16 delegates to Mondale's 15 delegates. Again, this was considered Jackson's home state, but did show that he could possibly win in a caucus state. The next day after the March 17th caucuses, the candidates had another debate in Chicago, where they continued to attack each other, with Mondale attacking Hart on civil rights and Jackson attacking both of them for not backing Chicago Mayor Harold Washington against Alderman Ed Verdoliak. You can watch more about those two in my video about the 1983 election for Chicago Mayor here. Mondale responded by saying that he didn't want to get involved with local Chicago politics, but Jackson reminded Mondale that he didn't mind that when he endorsed Richard Daley for mayor in 1983. But the Cook County Democratic machine, which was chaired by Verdoliak, had actually endorsed Mondale and had been working actively to get him elected. And in the end, it helped. Mondale was at 42% of the vote, with Hart finishing at 37% and Jackson at 19%. In Chicago, Jackson won 41%, but Mondale wasn't far behind at 35%. This result also showed the fact that while Jackson might be able to win black voters, his inability to do well with white voters made him seen as not a viable candidate to take on Ronald Reagan in the general election. On top of that, Jackson only received 6 out of Illinois' 194 delegates, making it even more difficult to be considered the kingmaker in the nomination process, unless the remaining contests had Mondale and Hart essentially tied. The next primary of note was the Wisconsin primary on April 3rd, which Hart won 44% to 41% for Mondale. However, this was a show primary, as the delegates at the convention were picked in county caucus conventions, which eventually favored Mondale. But the big blow to Gary Hart was the New York primary, with Walter Mondale winning 46% to Hart's 27.8%. Interestingly, Jesse Jackson finished a strong third, winning 26% of the primary votes. But as with Illinois, Jackson only won 51 delegates to Hart's 77 delegates. From this point on, Mondale would pick up more wins, especially in important states like Pennsylvania and Missouri, where he dominated. More importantly, Mondale was starting to pile up superdelegates, allowing him to pull even further from Hart. This meant that Hart needed to win as many pledged delegates as possible, as he really couldn't count on superdelegates coming over to his side anymore. The May 8th primaries did give Hart a little bit of hope, as he would win both the Iowa and Indiana primaries. But even with these victories, the delegate count from Ohio was even at 80 each, and Hart only won 7 more delegates in Indiana, winning 38 to Mondale's 31. As for Jackson, he was still winning delegates and having some decent showings, but the delegates that he was winning didn't seem to be making a dent in Mondale's totals. The last remaining important primaries were in California and New Jersey, states where Mondale expected to do well. But while campaigning in California, Hart said that he was happy to be campaigning in California because he was able to hold koala bears during their time campaigning. On the other hand, he said that when he was in New Jersey, he was handling samples from a toxic waste dump. Yeah, that didn't help Hart in New Jersey, with Mondale winning 45% in the state to Hart's 30%, and Jackson at 24%. But in California, Hart was able to win, beating Mondale by 3.5% and netting 116 delegates. Still, that wasn't enough. The next day, the Mondale campaign said that they now had enough delegates to win the Democratic nomination when combining their pledged and unpledged delegates. However, the unpledged delegates could always change at the last minute. Going into the Democratic convention, neither Hart nor Jackson had dropped out of the race. Jackson complained that the way that the delegates were awarded was unfair, and fast forward a few years later, and Jackson was able to change the delegate selection rules for the Democrats, which are essentially the rules that we have today. But Jackson knew that he wasn't going to win the nomination, but still hoped to have an influence on the vice presidential pick and the party's platform. On the night before the DNC convention, Hart met with Jackson to see if they could combine their delegates to challenge Mondale and possibly pressure superdelegates to make Hart the nominee. Jackson refused, as he wanted his name to be placed in nomination at the convention. And with that being the case, that was it. Mondale was able to win the nomination and go on to get absolutely embarrassed by Ronald Reagan in the general election. While this primary isn't talked about a lot, it was an important flashpoint when it comes to the current Democratic Party. Glenn representing the center-right, Hart representing the center and new and younger voters, Mondale representing the old liberal faction, Jackson representing the civil rights movement, and McGovern and Cranston representing the old anti-war crowd. This was much more of a diverse field than most people get a credit for. And honestly, a 50-minute video doesn't do this topic enough justice. And with that, we have finally finished today's video. If you would like to learn more about why Fritz Hollings was one of the most qualified candidates for president, check out the video on the left. If you want to know more about the mayor's race in Chicago in 1983, you can check that out on the right. Remember to subscribe to the channel, like the video if you made it this far, and become a Patreon member if you would like to support the channel. Thanks for now, and I will see you in the next video.